So, how exactly will your, we'll say, risk profile or demographics, whatever, information about you basically be used to define what you can do with your money, right? Specifically with respect to a US CBDC system, right? And this is pulling heavily from, or I guess the information is coming heavily from a recent paper published in September of 2022 by the White House's Office of Science and Technology, right? And so basically where we're really going with this is access tiering, right? Kind of creating quite literally a hierarchy for the access you can have to funds, limitations you could possibly have, that sort of thing. Whether this be the amount you can transact, the number of transactions you can do, interest rates you can get, whatever the case may be, right? Access in general, right? And that's one of the things you have to keep in mind when we're talking about central bank digital currencies, because really what it's for, right? Is since there's no like, this is what it's going to be for the United States. It's basically like, this is a potential U.S. central bank digital currency. These are the design choices it could have, kind of doing a cost-benefit analysis, more or less to a kind of superficial degree, at least the paper is, for every little design choice that you could think of. I think there's 18 total, but regardless. So basically, what we're talking about is access tiering, and more specifically, for tiering by user account, where basically the defining characteristics for access for each tier in the hierarchy is you, right? Your demographics, your behavior, whether that be taken from, I don't know, maybe survey or directly from the transactions that you do, right? That sort of thing, right? And there can be obvious kind of problems with, say, like discrimination and that sort of thing in there, or at least implied, right? So to take directly from the Office of Science and Technology's paper, right, access tiering refers to the various features that a CBDC system offers that vary based on attributes of a given transaction. And when we're talking about tiering by user account, those attributes for the given transaction are you, right? I guess is you. And basically, to give an example of this, right? So basically, lower tiers for the users could basically be defined by the amount of ID verification that you get. So depending on how much personal information you give for whatever transaction, if it's based purely on each transaction, or if it's account based, that all kind of depends to a certain degree. What limitations will be granted to you, kind of directly proportional to the amount of information you give, right? And so one thing that should be kind of obvious, but it doesn't seem like people really think directly to it, but this type of tiered system really requires, to a significant degree, the basically storing of different amounts of, we'll say, permanent and temporary history, data about you, and that your transactions, financial behaviors, that sort of thing, right? Because how else are they going to accurately tier this stuff, right? So keeping that in mind. So as you can probably tell, when you're tiering by user account, it's really supposed to be, as they say, to use their own words, a risk-based approach, right? Based on your user profile, right? And so this could raise obvious questions of equity, right? And that sort of thing. And also, this also kind of obviously parlays or gives credence to why I named the title of the video this. But, right, a major thing that needs to be defined, right, is what exact information is being used to determine a customer's risk profile, right? Because superficially, it seems like this could be parallels could easily be drawn to, say, like credit card information, right? Your credit scoring and that sort of thing, right? And to what degree that is, or that kind of parallel is accurate, depends. Again, the devil is in the details. They don't have, or at least I haven't been able to find yet, kind of more in-depth information on what exact information they're using, how exact it would be, or I guess I should say would be using, because again, it's a potential US CBDC system, technically not happening for sure as of yet, at least from their words, again, coming from both academic and, we'll say, white papers from like the Federal Reserve, other central banks, or the White House in this case, that sort of thing, right? But regardless, to give an example of what this could mean and to directly quote from the paper itself, such a system might subject immigrants to enhanced due diligence if they engage in more cross-border payments to send money home, right? And I talked a little bit about this in previous videos with respect to cross-border payments, because that's one major push, I'll say selling point for CBDCs, right, is basically financial inclusion and that sort of thing, to where basically like remittance payments and that sort of thing can be sent across borders much more easily. But then you have to think about interoperability and a whole bunch of other stuff. There's a lot of other questions about how the system itself would be structured that need to be answered, right? But to stay on topic with tiering based on user account, or U, right? So basically the big question could be discrimination of users. Obviously they're using your information, whatever that happens to be, whenever they just decide to define it explicitly, or even if they do, right? Then how exactly is that going to affect you, right? How would they tier it so that, you know, the limitations, whether it be on the amount you can transact or the number of transactions you can do, that sort of thing, to what degree does that go, right? And one major kind of concern, I'll say, or should be obvious, I think, is basically this sets hard boundaries on what you can do with your finances, right? Or financially, right? And that also kind of depends, again, you know, are you even like allowed outside of the CBDC system? What degree of we'll say domestic interoperability is there with a potential US CBDC system and say like, you know, the regular banking system, or we'll say fiat system, to kind of keep everything and try to lump it together somehow, right? Even though there's obviously nuances between our traditional financial system, but just to draw that kind of distinction, right? And this problem would be amplified significantly if this US CBDC system is automated to a significant degree, right? Because how are you going to argue with machines or computer programs, right? If it's basically like, especially if you can't really interact with it and it's basically just an output that you have to deal with, more or less. Like, again, how are they calculating your risk profile? What information are they using? That's all pertinent information that's necessary, but hasn't exactly been published to a significant degree, it seems, right? But anyways, so basically, if you enjoy, before I close out, one sec. If basically the biggest example that I gave for the different tierings, right, the different tiers in this kind of hierarchy of access, so to speak, was ID verification, because that's the one that they use most. It seems most prominently in the paper, because a lot of the times, anti-money laundering and counter-financing terrorism compliance is brought up all the time in like every design choice. And if they're talking about CBDCs, it's probably in there somewhere. I don't think, at least it doesn't come to mind, at least one paper or publication or whatever that I've read about CBDCs that doesn't have that in there somewhere, right? How can they control the transactions more to prevent money laundering, right? And financing terrorism. So keeping that in mind, if you can think of something other than just ID verification to kind of, we'll say, tier these transactions, and there's a few other ones that I will go over explicitly, like who your counterparty is, the amount of, again, the transaction amounts, right? Kind of like, you know, if it's more than $500, there's more verification needed, whatever it may be. Feel free to put it in the comments. I love that type of discussion. It would be interesting, because a lot of the times, like making these videos, I don't think of every little thing, obviously. And it's one of those things, as you read more and more, and kind of throughout time, you just kind of fill in gaps that you weren't even cognizant of before. But anyways, love feedback on that kind of stuff. So also along with that, make sure to subscribe if you like these kind of more deep dive-ish videos towards looking at more specific things, and trying to kind of truly understand like every little detail possible with a potential CBDC system, right? Especially in the United States in this case, right? So you guys don't miss that. And also, I'll put a card up in the top right. for the new video going on about this access tiering for transaction amount, right? So with that being said, I'm going to leave this one here, and I hope you guys have a good night.